Welcome to Conversations with the Commish. Today we're pleased to have join us the National Coordinator of Football Officials, Rogers Redding. Rogers, thanks for being with us.
Thank you, John. Thank you. It's a delight to be here. Thank you.
How the heck does one become a football official?
Oh, well, you know, it's interesting. There's no royal road to this, but I love the fact that football officials all start out exactly the same way. And I think the camaraderie you see among officials has to do with the fact that everybody starts the same. Pee-wee games, junior high games, everybody does all this building up brick by brick over a period of time. And so different people come to it from different aspects. I was on the faculty at University of North Texas. Had never thought about being a football official. I played in high school, but I wasn't either big enough or good enough or smart enough or fast enough to play in college. But a couple of guys that were doing high school ball in the area came to my office one day. One of them was a faculty member at North Texas, and the other was a staff member, and they said, "We'd like to get you involved in football officiating." I'd never thought about it, and so that's really how I got started.
You're in your 9th year as the National Coordinator of Officials.
Right.
What do you do in that role?
Part of my responsibilities has to do with assigning officials the conferences to the bowl games, postseason games. I do a lot of making presentations at clinics and workshops, conference meetings like this one. A lot of workshop activity, a lot of clinics. We've started the National Referees Conference. We've started the National Instant Replay Conference. So the idea is to have a consistent set of officiating around the country with interpretations and mechanics, the way we operate a game, the way we run a game. And so my role is mainly to work with those coordinators and with the commissioners to see that that happens on a national level.
Do you make the rules?
I don't make the rules. The Rules Committee makes the rules. For a while, I also served as a Secretary Rules Editor for NCAA Football Rules Committee. And the officials are charged with taking the rules that the Rules Committee makes and working out how to officiate them, how to mechanically operate the game under those rules, and how to enforce the rules. So we don't make them, but we have some input in making them, that's for sure. But the Rules Committee makes them, and then we try to implement them.
You mentioned earlier you started high school officiating back when you were in Texas. You were teaching there. How did you make the transition? And then you went on to officiate in the old Southwest Conference and then the SEC. How did you make the transition from high school officiating to college officiating?
Well, I started high school officiating, as I say, I was on the faculty at North Texas, and these guys came to get me to get started in this. And so I began to officiate at the junior high level and high school level, and I really liked it a lot. I moved my membership. Every organization, the communities have chapters of these officials, and the bigger games were in the Dallas chapter, and Denton's about 30 miles from Dallas, and so I joined the Dallas chapter after about 8 or 10 years in the Denton chapter, and I was lucky enough to be working with some guys in the Dallas chapter who were college officials, some of them in the Lone Star Conference, which is a Division II conference in Texas, and then at that time, the old Southwest Conference, which was the major conference in the state, in the Southwest. And so I got to know some of those guys, got an opportunity to work some scrimmages at SMU and TCU, which were close by, and one thing led to another, and I was able to get into college officiating. My big break came, one of my good friends, a guy named John Lewis, who was a side judge who was a referee in the Lone Star Conference, was being added to the staff of the Southwest Conference as a side judge. And he asked me to take his crew as a referee in the Lone Star. So that was my big break to get into college officiating.
What's the difference from when you moved to high school to college? What changes?
Well, first of all, let me mention what didn't change. What didn't change was the rules, because Texas is one of two states that play high school ball under NCAA rules, Texas and Massachusetts. Now, who would guess that combination? But anyway, and so I didn't have to learn a new set of rules. That was one good thing. The thing that is different at the college level, the thing I noticed more than anything else is the speed of the game, the speed of the players, makes the biggest difference in between high school and college. The talent level, of course, but just to watch a game and especially be on the field as an official, I noticed the much faster pace. I had to be much more prepared mechanically to officiate a game at the college level than at the high school level because of the speed of the players.
The number of officiating positions on the field. When you moved into the college game, what positions did you staff?
In high school, most of the high school games that I worked with were 4-man crews or 5-man crews. The Southwest Conference at the time was working 7-man crew. The Lone Star was working 6-man. Now everybody's gone to 7, but 6-man crews in the Lone Star Conference. And so personally, I had been a referee. Well, I started out, nobody starts out Pee Wee Junior High as a referee, but I became a referee in high school after about 3 or 4 years in that, and had done nothing but referee. And I was a referee in the Lone Star Conference. The Southwest Conference at that time did not bring anybody in as a referee, so I came in as a field judge. I had never worked deep position at all, and so I was learning on the job to be a field judge in the Southwest Conference.
When you talk about mechanics, for the people who aren't
Yeah.
intimately involved in being officiating, what do you mean?
Mechanics means not just the rules, but how we officiate the game, which means position, movement, keys. And so every position on the field, head linesman, line judge, side judge, field judge, back judge, umpire, referee, and a 7-man crew, and now center judge and an 8-man crew, they have a particular location that they have when the ball is snapped. They have a certain set of pre-snap responsibilities that they go through. And then once the play develops, they're looking at different keys. They're looking at different players at their primary keys. They have different zones of the field they're looking at. Obviously, they have a different view of it because as a referee, I'm behind the offensive team looking out toward the defense. The head linesman and the line judge on the line of scrimmage, they've got the offense over here, the defense over here. So they're looking mainly at the line of scrimmage. And so my responsibilities as a referee, for example, mechanics say that I'm going to be responsible mainly for the quarterback and the ball. I've got no clue what's going on deep downfield. And vice versa, the back judge and the deep officials, the field judge and the side judge, they've got their responsibility downfield. Once the ball is passed, let's say, they don't know what's going on with the quarterback. So we talk about mechanics, we mean position, movement, keys, zones of the field to officiate.
So in your role as national coordinator now, you spend more time focused on the rule or the interpretation of the rule or on the mechanics?
Probably 60-40 with rules versus mechanics. I would say that we get involved a lot in mechanics, and one of the things that we do is in addition to the rule book that the Rules Committee and the NCAA publishes, we publish through Referee Magazine, we publish a mechanics manual, which is really written by the officials. That's the one that we really control what the language is and all that sort of thing. So it's a manual that tells officials not anything about the rules, but here's how to officiate the game. And we go through every position on every kind of play. And so I probably spend, and as a national coordinator, I probably spend 40% of its energy on the mechanics and about 60% on rules. But the rules, part of the rules are not just the rules themselves, but interpreting the rules. How's this play going to be officiated? And that bleeds over into the mechanics. So there's an awful lot of cross-fertilization between mechanics and rules.
Are mechanics consistent by conference?
The dream is, here's the dream. The dream is that if you watch a football game, college football game, and you don't know the officials, you don't know anything about where they come from, the idea would be just to watch them officiate the game, you wouldn't be able to tell which conference they came from. We're a lot better than that than we used to be. In the early days, I would say 10, 15 years ago, you could tell how a game was officiated on the basis of the mechanics that the conference used. And officiating quite naturally grew up around conferences. And so the conferences had their own way of doing things. Some conferences had their own mechanics manual, for example. Well, once the CFO got started and the primary purpose of the College Football Officiating LLC was to get rid of that, was to have it so that all the conferences were working together, the coordinators are working together, the national coordinator is sort of directing all that to see to it that mechanics are the same from one conference to the next. The driver for that began when teams began to travel more and playing a lot of intersectional games. So the teams from the Northeast were playing teams on the West Coast. A coach on the West Coast shouldn't have to ask, how are you going to officiate the game today? Because he ought to be able to know it's going to be officiated pretty much like it is when it's conferences that he's in work the game. And I think it's a lot better than it was. There's still always improvement to be had, but we're a lot further along the road of consistent mechanics, interpretation of the rules nationally than we've ever been.
How many years did you spend as an official in the Southwest Conference?
I was an official in the Southwest Conference for 6 years.
You have a favorite memory from that time?
There's a lot of favorite memories from that time. I guess one of them was a game when I was officiating at Texas Tech. And Spike Dykes was the coach at Tech. I don't know if you knew Spike, but Spike was perfect for Southwest Conference and West Texas. And we were working a game out there, and I was refereeing, and the quarterback throws this long pass, and like I said, I got no clue what's going on down the field. But the Texas Tech at that time, they were the Red Raiders, and they had this tradition that when the touchdown was scored, they'd fire this cannon. And then this Red Raider rider mount his horse, black horse, and circle the field. And so the quarterback throws a pass as this touchdown, and they fire the cannon. The horse goes around the field, and I'm coming down to set up for the extra point. And here comes the field judge toward me, and he's got this bad look on his face. And I said, "Oh, what we got here?" And he said, "We don't have a touchdown." He said, "I thought I was on the goal line. I was on the 5-yard line when I signaled touchdown." And so I said, "Well, I got to go tell Spike what happened." So that's probably my biggest takeaway from the Southwest Conference. There's a lot of great stories, great teams, great coaches in the old Southwest Conference. That was a great league, and it was a lot of fun. But that one had to jump out as the most memorable instance of that.
And interesting tie-in back to the Mid-American Conference is the commissioner at that time was Fred Jacoby, a long-time beloved figure in the Mid-American Conference.
Yeah, right. And he was the Southwest Conference commissioner when I was there, and a wonderful man, a real gentleman of the game, as you know. So.
For those of us who have worked with you, we all think of you in terms of officiating. Yet you did have a life outside of officiating. You were an academic for many, many years. Yeah. Did undergrad at Georgia Tech, grad work at Vanderbilt, physical science. Taught at several institutions, a provost at several institutions. Did those skills and experiences accentuate your officiating?
You know, people have asked me that question. It's fairly rare for somebody who is in university academics or administration, either one, to get into football officiating. And what I found the common elements of this were several. One is you have to be a good football official and to be a good referee, you have to master a lot of detail. There's an awful lot of detail in the rules and mechanics that you have to be expert at. That's the same in academics. I developed, one of my skills is as a teacher, and for spending all that time in university life was in teaching, and I began to do a similar thing in football officiating, teaching at clinics, teaching at workshops. I wrote a textbook in physics, I wrote a study guide for officiating, and so those kind of writing skills, teaching skills, I think there's a lot of overlap. And then administration. I mean, if you think about it, one of the things that a football official, especially a referee, has to do is to manage a very complex environment. And as a dean and as a provost, I was managing a very complex environment. So the activities are very different in so many ways, but there's so many skills that are transferable from one to the other, like in life. There's so many skills that are transferable from administrative positions, from industrial positions, academic positions, and so But those are the ones that jump to mind to me in terms sort of the marrying the two apparently widely disjointed portions of my life.
You ultimately end up as an on-field official in the Southeastern Conference.
Right.
And then you end up migrating into the front office. Now
Yeah,
all of a
that's
sudden
right.
you're a coordinator of officials.
Yeah.
What's that like?
Well, it's different. I mean, that was a very different experience. I had refereed in the Southeastern Conference for 10 years, and then I retired from the field and worked a year as an instant replay official. And the coordinator of officials that hired me in the conference was Bobby Gaston, a longtime supervisor in the SEC, and Mike Slive was a commissioner at the time. And so he asked me, during the time I was an instant replay official, he asked me if I would become the coordinator of officials. Gosh, I had never thought about doing that and had no idea what that was going to be like. And so transitioned, only 2 years after I'd come off the field, I transitioned to being the coordinator. Now I'm involved with the coaches in a very different kind of way, with the institution in a very different kind of way. And I think the difference that I really noticed was when I was refereeing, once the game was over, I was through with that game, and I was going to get ready for the next game. As a coordinator of officials, once the game is over, that's almost when it starts, because then the coaches look at the film, they have concerns about calls in the game, the fans are concerned about that game, and so you can't put that game off your radar screen as quickly as you do as an official. I think also just the relationship between, instead of being an official, now you're responsible for their training, evaluation of the officials, deciding who works which games, all those kinds of things. So I think it would be very difficult to be a coordinator of officials not having officiated, but it is a different skill set for sure to come off the field and be a coordinator.
What's the hardest decision a coordinator has to make?
Well, there's several. I think that one of the hardest decisions that a coordinator has to make is trying to communicate to the official, it's time for you to go. To sort of communicate to an official that your time on the field now has got to come to an end, because you get to a certain age, you get to a certain level of you see your performance level slip. Officials are very much like athletes. Athletes are the last ones to know when it's time for them to go, and officials on the field are pretty much the same way. So I think that's from a personal standpoint and a personnel standpoint, you develop relationships with these people, but you're also their boss in a sense, because you decide which games are going to work, you decide how they're progressing through their career, you're evaluating them, you're criticizing them all the time, and people that you used to be colleagues with, guys that you worked on a crew with, now you're their boss. The same thing happens in academics. Mm-hmm. I mean, I was a faculty member at North Texas and then became the department chairman of that same department. Well, now I've got a very different relationship with faculty members as a chairman than I had as a colleague, and it's the same kind of thing in officiating.
One of these days when we look back on your tenure as the national coordinator, I think the two things we'll point to is the consistency in mechanics that you've driven, and maybe even more importantly is the emphasis on safety in rules. And so I think first and foremost on that is the work that was done on targeting.
Yeah.
That was, it took a lot of work. It wasn't just rubber stamped in. It was a lot of selling that had to be done and continues to be done.
Right. Talk
about how did that come about?
Well, it came about in a number of ways. When I was a coordinator at the SEC, after I'd been in that job for a couple of years, I became the rules editor for the NCAA football in 2008. And the targeting action, we didn't use that word at the time, but the action where players were really getting hit in the head, getting hit high, where players were the trend in the game was the players weren't so much tackling, they were just throwing their bodies at each other. And they started throwing their bodies at each other high. They were getting up in the danger zone. And so the rules committee, in my role as a rules editor, and beginning to see this as a coordinator, I felt like we've got to do something to draw attention to this action in the game and begin to think about how are we going to do this from a rules standpoint. And so the Rules Committee went through a lot of soul searching, a lot of heartache around this. There's always going to be this standing tension between football as a high-speed collision sport on the one hand and the safety of the players on the other. And I mentioned the speed, the difference in speed going from high school to college. The thing for me that has changed over time and which made the targeting rule such an important rule is the speed of the players. The speed of the players is much greater than it was in college 10, 12 years ago. Now, as an old physics guy, I know that kinetic energy goes as the square of the speed. You double the speed, you quadruple the energy. And so it became clear to me, and I was influential, I suppose, in helping the committee understand this. We've got to make a special rule that deals with this action because people are getting hurt, careers are being shortened, and so that was the beginning of it. And it's evolved over time. The disqualification wasn't there in the beginning. Instant replay was only beginning to be used, and so the fact of the role that instant replay now plays in targeting is a very important part of it. And so here we are, 10 or 11 years into this rule, and it still is evolving as it goes. But I think the fact that that the CFO, the officials, I think, as an organization, and your leadership as chair of the board of the CFO, has had a great impact on the Rules Committee's understanding of what needs to be done from a mechanic standpoint, from an officiating standpoint. How do we officiate this play? I think it's been a very important contribution that the entire officiating and rules world has made to the safety of the game.
For officials who are in the system, you're working for a Mid-American Conference, a Big Ten, an ACC, whatever, it seems to me there's probably never been a time where there's been more tools at their fingertips for training and development, clinics, the video or film review, et cetera, all those types of things. But having said that, is it easier to officiate today than it was maybe a decade or two ago?
It's easier to be trained because video has transformed how we train officials. There's no doubt about that. And now officials look at video all the time. It's become much more of a year-round activity because of looking at video. Little study groups will form in communities. They're studying the rules all the time. So the tools that are available by embracing the technology that's available, I think we've done a really good job with that. When I was in the Southwest Conference, that was in the VHS tape days. If we saw one tape a week, that was news. And now they're carrying video away from the games. They're looking up on YouTube. And so the way we train and evaluate officials has changed remarkably. But what's made it more difficult to officiate, again, is the speed of the players in the game and the fact that there's so much attention on the game and so much scrutiny of the game. The scrutiny of officiating is more than it's ever been. And we know that when we get into it. I mean, there's no question about it. But with slow-mo, with all the cameras, every game now is, essentially every game is on national television. Every FBS game is on national television. When I was even as an SEC official, I could go 2 or 3 weeks. I could say I was laboring in obscurity. There was no TV. Well, now that's all changed. So it's harder from the standpoint of being more intense attention paid to it, but the training and the tools and the technology has enabled us to do a better job of training officials.
Final question. Someone's at home, they want to get involved in football officiating. What should they do?
What they should do is locate whatever the local chapter is of a high school officiating association. And every major city and many small towns have some kind of organization. And what they need to do is to contact that organization and see how to get started at the local level. There's no grand plan and no sort of standard way of doing this because it so much depends on what's going on at the local level. So my advice to people is find out what organization it is in your community that's involved with football officiating at the high school, junior high, youth football level, and get involved at that level. That's the way everybody starts, and that is the very best way to get involved.
Rogers, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me. It's a joy to be able to do this. Thank you.
Thanks for joining us for this edition of Conversations with the Commish.